In 1842, a river began flowing through the air above New York City. Not a natural river, something stranger, something that shouldn't have been possible. 41 miles of water carried across valleys, over rivers, through solid granite, all of it held together by nothing more than wood, tar, and the calloused hands of men who would never drink from it. The Croton Aqueduct delivered 72 million gallons of fresh water every single day to a city that had been drinking from wells contaminated by its own sewage. And the men who built it? They worked in trenches that collapsed without warning. They hung from wooden scaffolding 100 feet above the Harlem River. They sealed joints with boiling pitch that burned through clothing and skin. Most of them were Irish immigrants, fresh off coffin ships, desperate enough to accept 60 cents a day for work that killed their friends. Their names never made the newspapers. Their graves, when they got graves at all, went unmarked. But here's what those newspapers did report. On July 4th, 1842, when water first flowed into the receiving reservoir at what is now the Great Lawn in Central Park, church bells rang across Manhattan. Cannons fired. Tens of thousands of people gathered to watch fountains shoot 50 feet into the sky. The mayor gave a speech about American ingenuity, about progress, about the triumph of civilization over nature. The celebration lasted 3 days. Parades wound through the streets. Restaurants served special menus. Poets composed odes to the new water supply. Businessmen gave toasts to the city's future prosperity. And everyone agreed that this was a triumph of the American spirit, proof that the young nation could accomplish anything it set its mind to. Somewhere in that celebrating city, Irish laborers nursed injuries from the construction. Widows of men killed at High Bridge wondered how they would feed their children. Workers still on the payroll rested their aching bodies and prepared to return on Monday to the endless maintenance that even a finished aqueduct required. He didn't mention the workers. Nobody mentioned the workers. The newspapers recorded the speeches. They described the fountains in ecstatic detail, the way the water caught the sunlight, the way the crowd cheered. They named the politicians and businessmen who attended. They noted which society ladies wore, which dresses. They devoted thousands of words to the engineering achievement. They did not print a single name of a single man who built it. And that's the story I want to tell you today. Not just how America built wooden aqueducts that carried rivers over valleys, but what it cost, who paid that cost, and why we've forgotten. Before we talk about what these men built, you need to understand what they were building against. The problem wasn't engineering. The problem was physics itself. Water doesn't climb. It flows downhill, always, without exception. If you want to move water from one place to another, you have exactly two options. You can pump it, which requires energy and machinery and breaks down constantly. Or you can let gravity do the work, which means your entire system, every single inch of it, must slope continuously downward from source to destination. Think about what that actually means. If you're bringing water from a mountain reservoir to a city 40 miles away, and that city sits at a certain elevation, your aqueduct must start higher than that elevation and never, not once, slope upward. Every hill in between is a problem. Every valley is a crisis. Every river crossing is an engineering challenge that would make modern contractors weep. The Romans understood this. They built aqueducts that still stand 2,000 years later, but the Romans built with stone and concrete. They had centuries of accumulated knowledge, armies of enslaved labor, and unlimited time. America in the 1830s had none of these things. What America had was wood, endless wood, forests so vast that European visitors couldn't comprehend them. White pine and red cedar and Douglas fir, straight-grained and strong and available in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. And America had something else the Romans never had: desperation. By 1832, New York City was dying of thirst. Not metaphorically, literally. The island of Manhattan sat surrounded by water it couldn't drink. The Hudson River was brackish, mixed with Atlantic saltwater. The East River wasn't a river at all, but a tidal strait, equally undrinkable. And the underground wells that had sustained the city for 2 centuries were failing. Not just failing, poisoning. 200,000 people lived on Manhattan by 1830. They produced waste. Human waste, animal waste, industrial waste. All of it seeped into the same aquifer they drew their drinking water from. Cholera swept through the city in 1832, on killing 3,500 people in a matter of weeks. Yellow fever followed. Typhoid became endemic. The city's death rate exceeded its birth rate. Manhattan was killing its own residents faster than new immigrants could replace them. The wealthy fled to country estates. The poor had nowhere to go. They drank the water, they got sick, they died, and when a fire broke out, which happened constantly in a city built almost entirely of wood, the fire brigades discovered something terrifying. There wasn't enough water pressure to fight the flames. Buildings burned to the ground while firefighters watched helplessly, their hoses producing nothing but a sad trickle. This is the context. This is why the Croton Aqueduct wasn't just an engineering project, it was survival. The Croton River flows through Westchester County, in the hills above, and crucially, it flows at an elevation high enough to reach Manhattan by gravity alone. The man who made this happen was named John Bloomfield Jervis. Remember that name. He was 40 years old in 1836 when construction began, and he had already spent half his life building canals. He'd worked on the Erie Canal as a young man, starting as an axeman clearing forest and rising to chief engineer of the Delaware and Hudson Canal. He understood water. More importantly, he understood the men who moved it. Jervis looked at the route from Croton to Manhattan and saw 41 miles of problems. The aqueduct would need to cross the Harlem River somehow. It would need to tunnel through solid rock at multiple points. It would need to span valleys where the ground dropped away beneath it, and it would need to do all of this while maintaining a precise gradient of just 13 inches per mile. 13 inches over 41 miles. If the slope was too steep, the water would flow too fast and erode the structure. If the slope was too shallow, the water wouldn't flow at all. The margin for error was essentially zero. For most of the route, Jervis designed what's called a masonry conduit, a tunnel basically, made of brick and stone buried beneath the surface. This worked fine where the ground was level. The laborers, most of them Irish immigrants fleeing the famine that would peak a decade later, dug trenches 8 feet deep. They lined them with brick, they sealed the joints with hydraulic cement that hardened underwater. They covered the whole thing with earth and moved on. But then they reached the valleys. At Sing Sing, the ground dropped away into a ravine. The aqueduct couldn't follow the terrain down and back up because water doesn't flow uphill. So the aqueduct had to bridge the gap. It had to carry the water straight across, suspended in the air, at exactly the same elevation as the sections on either side. Jervis could have built a massive stone arch, like the Romans. But stone arches take years to construct. They require skilled masons, not just laborers. They cost fortunes. And New York City didn't have years. People were dying. So Jervis did something audacious. He built the aqueduct out of wood. Not the whole aqueduct. Just the parts that had to cross open air. Wooden trestles, essentially. Giant scaffolding structures made of heavy timber, rising from the valley floor to support a wooden flume at the top. Water would flow through the flume, sealed tight against leakage, while the whole structure stood on legs like some impossible wooden spider. If you've never seen a wooden trestle bridge, it's hard to convey the scale. Imagine a lattice of beams, each one a foot thick and 30 feet long, bolted and braced together into a framework that rises higher than the trees around it. Now imagine that framework stretching hundreds of feet across a valley with nothing but wooden pegs and iron bolts holding it together. Now imagine that framework carrying millions of gallons of water, continuously, day and night, year after year. That's what Jervis built. Multiple times, and each crossing required workers to climb that scaffolding while it was still under construction, hauling timber on their shoulders, hammering joints into place while the wind tried to knock them off. The men who did this work weren't professional construction workers. There was no such thing. They were farmers who'd lost their land to English landlords, fishermen whose boats had rotted, weavers whose looms had been replaced by machines. They came from villages in Cork and Galway and Sligo, places where English policies had made survival impossible. They boarded ships that were little better than floating coffins, survived crossings that killed a significant percentage of passengers, and arrived in New York with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a desperate need for wages. The aqueduct contractors knew exactly what they had: a workforce that couldn't say no, a workforce that would accept dangerous conditions because the alternative was starvation, a workforce that wouldn't complain to authorities because the authorities didn't care about Irish immigrants. 60 cents a day. That was the wage. From dawn until dusk, summer heat, and winter cold, 60 cents. A skilled caulker might earn $1. A foreman might earn $2. But the men swinging picks and hauling timber, 60 cents? For that 60 cents, they risked everything. The Harlem River crossing was the most dangerous of all. The Harlem River isn't wide, maybe 600 feet at the point where the aqueduct needed to cross, but it's deep with a strong tidal current and the banks are steep. Jervis couldn't build a wooden trestle here because the river was navigable. Ships needed to pass underneath. He needed a permanent stone bridge, high enough for sailing vessels to clear. What he built was High Bridge, and the construction of High Bridge killed more men than any other section of the aqueduct. The bridge required 15 stone arches, each spanning 80 feet, rising 140 feet above the water. The piers that supported those arches had to be founded on bedrock beneath the riverbed. That meant cofferdams. Temporary wooden walls driven into the river bottom pumped dry, allowing workers to excavate down to solid stone. The cofferdams leaked constantly. Workers stood in freezing water up to their waists, digging through mud and gravel, while hand pumps struggled to keep pace with the seepage. When a cofferdam wall failed, which happened more than once, the river flooded in without warning. Men drowned in the darkness before they could climb out. Above the water, the work was equally deadly. Stone masons worked on scaffolding that swayed in the wind. Each arch required temporary wooden centering, a curved form that supported the stones until the keystone locked them in place. Building that centering meant hanging over the water on rope ladders, hammering boards into position while boats passed beneath. The Irish workers called High Bridge the Widowmaker. They weren't wrong. One account from the period describes what happened when a centering scaffold collapsed during construction of the 7th arch. 12 men were working on the structure when the supports gave way. They fell 80 feet into the river below. 8 of them drowned before rescuers could reach them. The newspaper reported this in a single paragraph. No names were given, no follow-up appeared. Construction continued the next day. This is what I mean when I say these men were invisible. Their deaths weren't hidden exactly. They were simply unimportant. The project mattered. The workers didn't. When they died, they were replaced. The roster changed, but the work went on. We know this happened because occasional accounts survive in engineering journals and newspaper archives, but we don't know most of it. We don't know how many men died in tunnel collapses along the road. We don't know how many fell from wooden trestles at Sing Sing and elsewhere. We don't know how many burned themselves badly enough with pitch that they couldn't work, which for a man with no savings meant they couldn't eat. The workers weren't the story. The water was the story. Construction of the Croton Aqueduct employed over 4,000 men at its peak. The project took 6 years. When it was finished, it was one of the engineering marvels of the age. Europeans traveled across the Atlantic just to see it. Engineers came from around the world to study its design. And the workers who built it, they scattered to other jobs, other projects, other opportunities to trade their lives for wages. The aqueduct they built outlived them all. But the Croton Aqueduct wasn't the most ambitious wooden water system in 19th century America. That distinction belongs to the mining flumes of California. And the scale of what happened there defies belief. When James Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848, he triggered the largest mass migration in American history. Within 2 years, California's population exploded from 14,000 to over 300,000. Men poured in from everywhere, from New England and the Deep South, from China and Chile, from every country in Europe. They came to get rich. The problem was, the easy gold didn't last long. Surface deposits, the stuff you could pan from a stream bed, played out within months. The remaining gold was locked in ancient riverbeds, buried under hundreds of feet of gravel and stone, trapped in veins of quartz that ran through the mountains like frozen lightning. Getting that gold out required water, massive quantities of water, not to drink, to destroy. Hydraulic mining was the answer. The concept was brutally simple. You built a flume that carried water from a mountain stream to a nozzle called a monitor. The monitor concentrated that water into a jet capable of cutting through solid rock. You aim that jet at a hillside and wash the entire hillside away, collecting the gold-bearing gravel in sluices downstream. But here's the catch. Water pressure depends on elevation drop. The higher your water source above your target, the more pressure you generate. And the gold deposits were in the Sierra Nevada foothills, which meant the water sources had to be even higher, up in the mountains themselves, miles away from the mining sites. The miners needed wooden flumes that stretched for dozens of miles across some of the most rugged terrain on Earth. The largest was the Eureka Lake and Yuba Canal system. When completed in 1871, when it stretched over 700 miles, not a typo, 700 miles of wooden channels carrying water from high mountain lakes through forests, across canyons, around cliff faces, to mining operations throughout the northern Sierra. 700 miles of wood that had to be built, sealed, and maintained in wilderness areas accessible only on foot or horseback. 700 miles of constant repair and replacement, because wood rots and breaks and burns. 700 miles paid for in human labor, most of it by men whose names were never recorded. Some sections of these flumes clung to sheer rock walls where no flat ground existed. Workers called them hanging flumes. They were exactly what they sounded like. Wooden channels bolted directly into the rock face, suspended over drops of hundreds of feet, with nothing beneath them but air. Building a hanging flume meant drilling holes into vertical stone, by hand, with hammers and chisels and star drills that you rotated a quarter turn between each blow. A good worker might drill a 6-inch hole in an hour. Each support bracket required multiple holes. Each mile of flume required hundreds of brackets. The workers who drilled those holes hung from ropes anchored at the top of the cliff. They worked with their backs to the void, facing the rock, feeling for the next foothold with their toes while their hands swung the hammer. When a rope frayed or an anchor pulled loose, they fell. There was no safety equipment, no harnesses as we'd recognize them, no rescue team standing by. You worked carefully or you died. Many men didn't work carefully enough. We have no complete count of how many men died building California's mining flumes. The companies didn't report fatalities. The local newspapers occasionally mentioned a Chinaman falling to his death, not even bothering to record his name. Chinese workers built the most dangerous sections because white workers often refused. The Central Pacific Railroad gets remembered for its Chinese laborers, and rightfully so, but the mining flumes employed just as many Chinese workers in conditions just as deadly, and almost no one remembers them at all. They hung from cliff faces, they handled explosives, they built structures that made fortunes for men who despised them. When the work was done, they were pushed out, driven from mining camps, prohibited from owning claims, denied citizenship. Their contribution to California's development was erased as thoroughly as the mountains they helped wash away. The structural genius of these flumes deserves recognition, even as we acknowledge the human cost. Wood expands when wet and contracts when dry. A flume carrying water experiences both conditions simultaneously. The bottom is saturated, the exposed sides dry in the mountain sun. This differential swelling would tear most structures apart. The flume builders solved this with tight-fitting joints and iron straps that allowed controlled movement. They sealed the wood with a combination of oakum, which is tarred hemp fiber twisted into rope, and hot pitch, which is essentially liquid tar. Caulkers worked on their knees, pounding oakum into seams with mallets and irons, then pouring boiling pitch over everything. And boiling pitch is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. A splash could cause third-degree burns. A spill could set a man's clothing on fire. The fumes alone were toxic enough to cause permanent lung damage. Caulkers worked in the summer heat with no protection beyond whatever rags they could wrap around their hands. If you've never smelled hot pine pitch, it's difficult to describe. Sweet and acrid at the same time, penetrating your sinuses and settling in your lungs with a weight you can feel. The smoke from the fires used to heat. It stung your eyes until tears ran down your cheeks. After a day's work, the smell clung to your hair and clothes and skin. It didn't wash out. It faded, slowly, over days. The heat was relentless. California summers in the Sierra foothills regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Right, the pitch needed to be kept liquid, which meant fires burning constantly. The men worked within arm's reach of those fires, their backs to the sun, their faces to the flames. Heat stroke killed some of them, burns killed others. The combination of exhaustion and impaired judgment from heat and fumes led to accidents that killed still more. A caulker's tools were simple: a caulking mallet, heavy and flat-faced, a set of caulking irons, like wide chisels with offset handles, a bucket of oakum, pre-twisted into ropes of varying thickness, and the pitch pot, a cast iron cauldron suspended over a fire, the black liquid bubbling and smoking inside. The work itself was precise. You selected a rope of oakum appropriate to the seam you were filling. You laid it into the joint, then used the iron to drive it down, the mallet striking the iron in a rhythm that good caulkers could maintain for hours. Too light a blow and the oakum wouldn't seat properly. Too heavy and you'd split the wood. The sound of a caulking crew at work was distinctive, a percussion section playing the same beat over and over, echoing off the valley walls. After the oakum was seated, you poured the pitch. You tilted the pot carefully, controlling the flow, watching the black liquid fill the seam and soak into the hemp fiber below. If you poured too fast, the pitch would overflow and run down the outside of the flume, wasting material and creating a fire hazard. If you poured too slow, the pitch would start to harden before the seam was filled. Good caulkers could feel when the joint was properly sealed. Something about the way the pitch settled, at the way it stopped absorbing into the wood. They'd move on to the next seam, leaving behind a joint that might last years or might fail by winter, depending on factors nobody fully understood. The process had to be repeated constantly throughout the system. A flume that leaked was a flume that failed. Water seeping through the wood would rot the structure from within. In freezing conditions, water in the joints would expand to ice, forcing the boards apart. A small leak would become a large leak. A large leak would become catastrophic failure. Maintenance crews lived in camps scattered along the hundreds of miles of flume. They walked their sections daily, looking for problems, fixing what they could, reporting what they couldn't. In winter, when snow buried the mountains under 10 or 15 feet of white, so they waited in their cabins and hoped the system survived until spring. The maintenance camps were rough places, wooden shacks with dirt floors, built close enough to the flume that the men could hear the water flowing at night. A good flume walker learned to listen for changes in that sound. A leak produced a different note than solid flow. A partial blockage created its own distinctive gurgle. You could diagnose problems by ear if you paid attention. The flume walkers carried tools: hammers, chisels, spare planks cut to standard sizes, buckets of pitch that they kept warm over small fires. When they found a leak, they patched it on the spot if possible. When they found structural damage, they sent word back to the main camp and hoped the repair crew could reach them before the damage spread. Loneliness was a constant companion. A flume walker might go weeks without seeing another person. He'd talk to himself just to hear a human voice. Some men couldn't handle the isolation and quit after a single season. Others adapted and became strange, speaking in fragments, uncomfortable around groups, more at ease with the sound of flowing water than human conversation. The wildlife became familiar: bears that had learned to associate the camps with food, mountain lions that watched from rocky outcrops but rarely approached, rattlesnakes that sought warmth near the cabins. The men learned which animals were dangerous and which were merely annoying. They learned the rhythms of the mountain seasons, when the snow melt would swell the flow, when the summer drought would slow it to a trickle, when autumn storms would test every joint and brace. Some of them died up there. heart attacks in men too far from help, falls from structures they were repairing, encounters with wildlife that went badly. A maintenance worker who died alone in winter might not be found until spring, when the snow receded and revealed what the cold had preserved. Many sections didn't survive. Every year brought news of washouts, collapses, and failures, a landslide that took out a trestle, a fire that jumped from the forest to the structure, a flood that overwhelmed the channel and ripped it apart. After all that work, after all that death and suffering, the flumes did exactly what they were designed to do. They brought water to the monitors, and the monitors destroyed mountains. Hydraulic mining was environmental devastation on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Entire peaks were washed into rivers. Mountains that had stood for millions of years vanished in months. The monitors worked around the clock, their jets cutting through solid bedrock with a hiss that could be heard for miles. If you stood near an operating monitor, the noise was deafening. A roar like continuous thunder, so loud that workers communicated through hand signals. The spray filled the air with a constant mist that soaked everything within 100 yards. The ground shook as tons of debris slumped into the sluices below. The landscape left behind looked like nothing natural. Raw cliffs of exposed earth, carved into fantastic shapes by the water jets. Piles of boulders too large to wash away. Bare clay slopes, the color of wounds, bleeding red and brown with each rainfall into the streams below. The Yuba River's bed rose 20 feet as sediment filled it. Towns that had been built along its banks found themselves below river level, protected only by makeshift levees that breached regularly. Marysville flooded 9 times between 1853 and 1875, each flood worse than the last as the riverbed rose higher. Downstream towns flooded repeatedly. Sacramento itself sat under 6 feet of mining debris after one storm in 1862. The state capitol building was accessible only by boat. Legislators rode to work through streets that had become canals, dodging floating debris that included not just sediment, but entire trees, dead livestock, and the contents of warehouses whose walls had collapsed. Farmland in the Central Valley was buried under gravel and silt. Orchards that had fed communities for decades were destroyed, had their trees buried up to the branches or knocked down entirely by the force of the floods. Farmers who had cleared and planted and tended that land for years found themselves staring at fields of gravel where wheat had grown the season before. Salmon runs that had sustained indigenous peoples for millennia vanished as spawning beds were choked with mining waste. The fish that tried to spawn found their eggs buried under silt. The ones that managed to hatch found themselves in water so thick with sediment that their gills clogged. The salmon that had returned to California's rivers every year, in numbers that darkened the water, simply stopped coming. The farmers fought back. They formed anti-debris associations. They lobbied the state legislature. They filed lawsuits. And in 1884, Judge Lorenzo Sawyer issued his famous decision in Woodruff versus North Bloomfield Mining Company. Hydraulic mining was banned in California. The decision came too late to save the mountains that had already been washed away. An estimated 1.5 billion cubic yards of sediment had been dumped into California's rivers and valleys. Some of it is still there today, a permanent monument to what those wooden flumes made possible. The flumes themselves were abandoned. Without hydraulic mining, there was no need for the massive volumes of water they carried. Some were repurposed for agricultural irrigation on a smaller scale. Most simply rotted where they stood. Today, fragments remain scattered through the Sierra foothills, weathered boards jutting from cliff faces, rusted iron straps wrapped around nothing, on concrete footings where wooden posts once stood. If you know where to look, you can find them. Relics of an industry that reshaped the landscape and vanished within a generation. Let me step back now and talk about how these structures actually worked, because the engineering, divorced from its human and environmental cost, is genuinely remarkable. A wooden aqueduct or flume is essentially a precisely graded artificial river. The water flows through it by gravity, which means the structure must maintain a constant downward slope from beginning to end. The steeper the slope, the faster the water flows and the less capacity the flume has. The shallower the slope, The slower the water moves, but the more it can carry. Most flumes used a gradient between 1 foot per 1,000 feet and 5 feet per 1,000 feet, depending on their purpose. Mining flumes that needed high-pressure water at the far end used steeper grades. Aqueducts carrying water for cities used shallower grades to maximize volume. Building to these tolerances with 19th century technology was extraordinarily difficult. There were no laser levels, no GPS, no electronic surveying equipment. There were transit theodolites, hand-drawn maps, and very careful mathematics. A surveyor would establish a benchmark elevation at the starting point, then work his way along the proposed route, calculating the required elevation at each point. Errors accumulated. Every measurement contained some small inaccuracy. Over 40 miles, those small inaccuracies could add up to errors of several feet. If the error made the grade too steep, the water would flow too fast. If the error made the grade too shallow, the water wouldn't flow at all. Either way, the entire project failed. The Croton Aqueduct's original survey took 2 years. John Jervis ran the route 3 separate times with different survey teams, then averaged the results. Even then, he built adjustment chambers at regular intervals, allowing workers to modify the grade slightly after construction if water flow proved inadequate. Once the grade was established, construction began with the wooden trestle supports. These followed a standard pattern. 4 main posts, each typically 12 to 18 inches square, set in pairs on opposite sides of the intended channel. Diagonal braces connecting the posts to resist side-to-side movement. Cross members at the top to support the flume itself, and foundations that varied based on ground conditions. On solid rock, the posts sat on iron brackets bolted directly to the stone. On soft ground, they rested on timber cribbing filled with gravel and rocks. In swampy areas, where the ground couldn't support concentrated loads, the builders drove wooden piles deep into the muck until they hit something solid, then built the trestle on top of the pile caps. The flume box itself was typically made of 2-inch planking, though critical sections used 3 or even 4 inches. The bottom planks ran lengthwise, with the grain oriented to minimize water penetration. The side planks ran crosswise, butting against vertical posts that held the shape. Iron straps wrapped around the outside every few feet, providing additional support. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, provided crucial experience for the engineers who later built wooden aqueducts. The canal itself was largely a ditch, but it crossed several rivers on wooden aqueduct structures that remain among the most audacious timber engineering projects ever attempted. The Schoharie Creek Aqueduct was particularly impressive. Built in 1841, it carried the entire Erie Canal across Schoharie Creek on a wooden trunk 624 feet long. And when I say it carried the canal, I mean exactly that. Not just water, boats, fully loaded canal boats weighing tons floating across a wooden structure suspended above a creek. Stand on the banks of Schoharie Creek today and try to imagine what you would have seen in 1845. A wooden box 14 feet wide and 7 feet deep, stretching across the valley on stone piers. Inside that box, 4 feet of water, and moving through that water, canal boats 60 feet long, loaded with grain or coal or manufactured goods, pulled by mules walking on a towpath built alongside the flume itself. The engineering had to account for the static weight of the water, which alone exceeded 3 million pounds. It had to account for the dynamic weight of moving boats and the surging forces when boats passed each other. It had to account for wind loads and ice formation and the inevitable expansion and contraction of wood with changes in temperature and moisture. The mules added their own challenges. Their hooves beat a constant rhythm on the towpath planking, loosening bolts and nails, wearing grooves into the wood. The towpath had to be replaced every few years because the mule traffic simply wore it out. Canal boat captains told stories about crossing the Schoharie Aqueduct in winter, when ice formed on the water's surface and creaked against the wooden walls. The sound, they said, was like nothing else: groaning timber, cracking ice, the slosh of water finding its level, and beneath it all, the rush of Schoharie Creek flowing beneath them, 30 feet below. These canal aqueducts taught engineers what worked and what didn't. They learned that white pine was better than hemlock because it resisted rot longer. They learned that iron straps needed to be galvanized or they'd rust through within years. They learned that foundations needed to extend below frost line or freeze-thaw cycles would lift them out of the ground. They also learned what failure looked like. The original Schoharie Aqueduct, built in 1825, collapsed in a flood just 4 years after opening. The replacement, engineered with stronger foundations and better bracing, lasted until the canal system itself became obsolete. But those 4 years of failure taught lessons that would later save lives on the Croton Aqueduct and the California flumes. Each failure was a lesson, each collapse was data. The men who died in those failures contributed involuntarily to the body of knowledge that made later structures safer and more durable. By the 1880s, the limitations of wooden water infrastructure were becoming impossible to ignore. Wood required too much maintenance. It didn't last long enough. And iron and steel and concrete had become cheap enough to compete. The Croton Aqueduct's wooden trestle crossings were gradually replaced with masonry structures. High Bridge itself was modified in the 1920s, and its original stone arches partially filled to create a stronger structure. The bridge still stands. It's the oldest bridge in New York City, but it looks nothing like what John Jervis built. New York's water system expanded with new technology. The new Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1890, was an all-masonry tunnel that could carry 3 times as much water as the original. The Catskill Aqueduct, finished in 1917, brought water from reservoirs even further north. Today, New York City's water system extends 125 miles into the Catskill Mountains, delivering over 1 billion gallons daily. The wooden infrastructure that made it all possible is gone, replaced, superseded, forgotten. In California, the end of hydraulic mining killed the wooden flumes that served it. Agricultural irrigation required smaller systems, so meant those systems were increasingly built of concrete and steel. The mountain flumes fell into ruin. Some were salvaged for their lumber. Old-growth timber, already cut and shaped, was valuable enough to haul out of the mountains. Other flumes burned in forest fires, returning their carbon to the atmosphere in minutes after standing for decades. Still others simply rotted in place, becoming nurse logs for new trees, their iron hardware rusting into the soil. What strikes me about these remnants isn't their engineering, though that remains impressive. It's their silence. These structures once carried rivers. They roared with millions of gallons of moving water. They were maintained by crews of men who lived their lives in service to their function. Now they're artifacts, historical curiosities. The men who built them, who maintained them, who died on them, have vanished completely from living memory. There's a particular kind of forgetting that happens with infrastructure. We use it daily without thinking about it. The water comes from the tap, the electricity flows through the wires, the roads take us where we need to go. We don't consider the labor embedded in these systems, the skill, the danger, the lives. I've stood at High Bridge and watched joggers pass without a second glance. I've hiked in the Sierra foothills and found fragments of flume that other hikers walk right past. The infrastructure is invisible. The labor is invisible. The sacrifice is invisible. The Irish immigrants who built the Croton Aqueduct didn't have a choice about the work they did. They needed wages to survive. The jobs that were available to them, the jobs nobody else wanted, happened to involve standing in flooded tunnels and hanging from scaffolding over rivers and breathing toxic fumes from boiling pitch. They did those jobs. Many of them died doing those jobs. And the city they built the aqueduct for barely noticed their existence while they were alive, and forgot them entirely after they were dead. The Chinese workers who built California's hanging flumes faced even harsher erasure. Anti-Chinese prejudice was so intense that their contributions were deliberately minimized, their deaths unrecorded, their very presence resented. They built infrastructure that made California's mining boom possible, and California rewarded them with exclusion acts and violence. There's a memorial now at High Bridge, installed in 2015 after the bridge was restored for pedestrian use. It mentions the workers who built it. It acknowledges their sacrifice. It's a good thing, as far as it goes. But I wonder how many of the runners and cyclists and families who cross High Bridge every day stop to read it. I wonder how many pause to consider that this beautiful stone structure, with its elegant arches and its views of the Manhattan skyline, is also a graveyard. Not literally. The bodies were buried elsewhere in unmarked graves in potters' fields, or shipped back to Ireland on the same coffin ships they'd arrived on. But metaphorically, every stone in High Bridge was placed by hands that belonged to men who risked everything for 60 cents a day. The thing about infrastructure is that it's designed to disappear. When it works, you don't notice it. You only notice when it fails. The Croton Aqueduct worked for nearly 50 years before it was superseded. The mining flumes worked until the courts shut down the industry they served. They worked because men maintained them, constantly, invisibly, thanklessly. We owe them something. I'm not sure exactly what. Recognition, certainly. Understanding, perhaps. A commitment to remember that progress has a price, and that price isn't paid equally by everyone who benefits from it. The wooden aqueducts and flumes of 19th century America are mostly gone now, rotted away, replaced by concrete and steel. The engineering problems they solved are still with us. Water still doesn't flow uphill. Gravity is still the cheapest way to move it. But we solve those problems differently now with materials and methods that require less labor and last longer. What we can't replace is the labor itself, the accumulated effort, the knowledge embedded in those structures. The men who built them took their skills to their graves, and much of what they knew died with them. We can study the remnants. We can read the engineering reports. But we can't truly understand what it was like to hang from a cliff face in the Sierra Nevada, drilling holes by hand into vertical rock, knowing that one mistake meant death. That knowledge is lost. The men are lost. What remains are the structures they built, slowly returning to the earth, and the water systems we use today standing on foundations they laid. The next time you turn on a tap and water flows out, consider the distance it traveled to reach you. Consider the infrastructure that carried it. And consider the people who built that infrastructure, whose names you'll never know, whose faces you'll never see, whose sacrifice made your daily life possible. They carried rivers over valleys. They moved water through the air. They did it with wood and pitch and iron and human muscle, and they did it knowing the risks. We drink from their labor every day. The least we can do is remember them.